This could begin anywhere, because it's going to take a lot of Dark Souls 3's world into account. I'm starting in the Undead Settlement, though, because that's the place we first encounter the Evangelists, and the first time we hear this.
Oh, cleanse the bastard's curse.
There are two words in Japanese that are the most likely candidates to be translated as bastard. One is insulting and one is significant. Those words are, respectively, kisama and otoshiko. Kisama is bastard in the pejorative, insulting sense, in which case the evangelist is just being rude. Otoshiko, on the other hand, is bastard in the literal sense, meaning a child who was born outside of wedlock. The connotation of otoshiko, however, is of something that is unwanted and abandoned, an unintended, unwanted child whose parents have cast it aside. Otoshiko is a recurring motif in the Japanese script of Bloodborne. Two of the major themes of Bloodborne are childbirth and evolution, and it designates certain creatures otoshiko to symbolize that they represent a kind of evolutionary dead end. Creatures who were left behind when other members of their species ascended into a more complex life form. The ancient otoshiko are brutish ape-like giants. The otoshiko of the more recent past are vampiric humanoid bat creatures. And if we assume, for once, that Patches is telling the truth, the otoshiko of the present are us.
Have mercy on the poor bastard.
This is the meaning I am taking from the evangelist's use of the word bastard. The evangelist is likening the undead to an unwanted, abandoned child. This is also consistent with her other spoken line of dialogue, in which she calls us a poor child, asks us to come to her, and then embraces us in a very maternal way.
Poor child, come to me.
To understand the exact role that the evangelists play in Undead Settlement, we have to go back to their place of origin, the Cathedral of the Deep. The evangelists came from the cathedral to the settlement, where they're said to have enlightened and mentored the settlement's inhabitants. What's currently being practiced in the settlement isn't the traditional faith of the settlement, it's what the evangelists brought with them from the cathedral. And yet this faith doesn't appear traditional to the cathedral either. All signs point to the cathedral and the undead settlement both sharing the same faith. This is hinted at by these same statues appearing in both the cathedral and in a smaller church in the undead settlement. The evangelist's faith was recently born in the cathedral, and then spread outward from there. Much of the present state of the cathedral points to a violent overthrow of the old order, which was overseen by the Way of White. In the original Dark Souls, the Way of White were based in Thorolund and worshipped a god called Allfather Lloyd. But by the time of Dark Souls 3, the Way of White are based in Karim, and Lloyd has fallen from favour. What's hinted at but not explicitly stated is that Lloyd's replacement in the Way of White's pantheon is Velka, the goddess of sin. Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 establish that Karim clerics are the worshippers of Velka, and there's a Velka statue found beneath the undead settlement, as well as other statues around the Cathedral of the Deep. Nobody explicitly identifies the statues in the cathedral as being Velka, but they strongly resemble the form taken by Sister Frida, and we hear Gale praying to one and addressing it as,
"Merciful Goddess, Mother of the Forlorn."
And yet, the statue that Gale is praying to is obscured by an altar depicting the Deacons of the Deep, and all around the cathedral, we see the same statue has been obscured, covered in a red cloth. It appears that fairly recently, a shift in the cathedral's faith has taken place, with the worship of Velka overthrown, probably violently. This seems to be the birth of the faith that the evangelists have taken to the settlement. What happened in the cathedral can be traced back to something called the Deep. The deep protection miracle tells us that the deep was once a peaceful and sacred place until it became the final rest for many abhorrent things. It's important to note the distinction. The deep itself was not the problem, but it became one with time because of what happened in the cathedral. In order to understand what the deep is, why it was worshipped, and what happened to it, it helps to look at the situation using Shinto as a framework. Shinto is usually described as the indigenous religion of Japan, but calling it a religion is something of a misnomer. While Shinto is a series of beliefs about the relationship between humans and the spirit world, it has no founder or holy texts, or even what most of us would think of as gods. It sees manifestations of spiritual power occurring in the natural world, and asks that people try to live alongside them and respect them. These manifestations are called kami. Kami can manifest in anything that's seen as sufficiently sacred. A tree, a rock, a waterfall, a mountain, even some historical figures, can be seen as either kami or the dwelling places of kami. One of the purposes of Shinto shrines and Shinto priests is to tend to the spiritual well-being of the local kami. The Cathedral of the Deep is not literally a Shinto shrine, and the faith practiced there is not literally Shinto, but it helps to understand that, in the culture that produced Dark Souls 3, a shrine or temple might exist to, at least in part, venerate a specific sacred place or sacred object. This helps make sense of what the Cathedral of the Deep is. It's not a cathedral in the Christian sense, and it's not a church that worships Velka, despite the statues. It's a sacred shrine defined by its proximity to something called the Deep, which was worshipped by the cathedral's clerics, and those clerics, being members of the Way of White, were worshippers of Velka, hence the statues. So what is the Deep? Unless the upcoming DLC changes things, the Deep is likely this large pool of dark water that's visible from a balcony where we find an evangelist and the Deep Gem. The evangelist appears completely transfixed by what she's looking at. Compare her to the mad evangelist Doris, who we find in Irithyll. We are told that Doris was driven mad because the Deep intoxicated her. The evangelist on the balcony seems to be taking a similar journey. There's precedent for the worship of sacred gorges, rivers, caves, and pools. In the town of Takachiho, in the appropriately named Miyazaki Prefecture, is the sacred cave Amano Iwato. Amano Iwato is deemed too sacred to enter, but, like the Deep, it can be observed from a balcony at a nearby shrine. Photographing the cave is likewise prohibited, but looking at images of the nearby Iwato River Gorge reveals a deep, dark, watery chasm, not unlike our view from the cathedral. Again, I want to stress that the Deep is not a stand-in for Amano Iwato, but it's something that can be understood along similar lines. It's a sacred, deep place, likely a cave or an underground river, which is seen as sacred and thus becomes the site of a shrine and has a group of clerics attending to it. But something happened to the Deep, and its nature changed, transforming it from something sacred, peaceful, and holy into something dangerous that corrupted the clerics who presided over it. Shinto is a belief system that places a lot of value on purity and purification. Coming into contact with impure things like dead bodies, blood, or excrement doesn't just leave a stain on the body, it leaves a stain on the spirit that can only be cleansed through ritual purification. Allowing these kinds of substances near a kami is incredibly disrespectful and could destroy the relationship that you have with it. To help demonstrate this particular line of thinking, I'm going to look at two films by, again, Miyazaki, this time Hayao Miyazaki, the animator. Both Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away feature plot points in which the actions of humans cause the body of a kami to become polluted, corrupting and transforming it. In Princess Mononoke, a boar spirit is shot with a cannonball, which becomes lodged in its flesh. This transforms the boar spirit from a benevolent forest spirit into a hostile mass of writhing worms who threatens the people he used to live alongside. Furthermore, the corruption is shown to spread on contact, and it infects the film's protagonist like a virus. Spirited Away contains a less violent and more comedic take on the same concept. The film contains a sequence in which a sentient mass of mud and slime, known only as the Stink Spirit, arrives at a bathhouse and asks to be bathed. After overcoming her disgust and agreeing to bathe him, the protagonist realizes that the Stink Spirit is in fact a river spirit, and that his form has changed because humans used his river as a dumping ground for garbage. By removing the garbage from the spirit's body, he's able to return to his original form. Like the other examples I've cited, none of this is directly allegorical, but it does provide a framework through which you can view the events surrounding the deep, something previously sacred and pure that was rendered impure through pollution. Around the Cathedral of the Deep, we find a wealth of corrupting substances that no one concerned with purity would allow in a sacred place. Poison, blood, dirt, excrement, and dead bodies. It's no wonder the deep became the resting place of abhorrent things when, on the basis of the cathedral, it effectively became a sewer. We learn a little more about the deep's contents from the spells Deep Soul and Great Deep Soul. Within the deep is a mass of souls from which it's possible to extract something called Dark Soul Dregs. These souls, described as stagnant, form what Archdeacon MacDonald thinks of as the glorious bedrock of the world. The human dregs item, which we're told is made from the heaviest things in the human body, is likewise in Japanese called human stagnation. This emphasis on the deep's contents being heavy and stagnant further draws on Shinto ideas of corruption and impurity. Water will wash away impurity, but only if the water remains in motion. The motion of a stream or a waterfall will carry any pollution it encounters away, and Shinto purification rituals mimic this motion by having water poured on the body, then cupped and poured again. This is not true of water that is still and stagnant, because without the motion of a current, any pollution will simply sink to the bottom and remain there. Stagnant water is also the breeding ground of mosquitoes and leeches, which is likely why we're told the deep is home to biting insects that feed on blood. How this all came to rest in the deep isn't something we're ever directly told. We'll learn later on that ritual bloodletting took place in the cathedral, and that's certainly a possible cause, but I'd suggest that a more likely cause is Aldrich's cannibalism.
Let's take Aldrich for one. A right and proper cleric. Only he developed a habit of devouring men. He ate so many that he bloated like a drowned pig, then softened into sludge. So they stuck him in the Cathedral of the Deep.
It wasn't just Aldrich who feasted on flesh in the cathedral, though. We learn that Aldrich shared his feasts with others, likely meaning the other clerics of the cathedral. This might explain why the evangelists, Archdeacon MacDonald and certain high-ranking members of the Aldrich faithful, are significantly more bloated than other human characters. Our eventual meeting with Aldrich in Anor Londo suggests that his feasts left behind piles of corrupted remains. The room in which he devoured Gwyndolin is filled with a dark, thick slime in which we can see what look like worms. We find a similar residue in certain places around the cathedral, and what used to be pure water is now an opaque brown soup. The remnants of Aldrich's feasts are likely what sunk down into the deep, poisoning what was once pure and sacred. As the deep grew more corrupt, the deacons, still members of the Way of White, changed their mission from worshipping the deep to, we are told, sealing away its horrors, until they, too, succumbed. We can watch a similar process play out in the present through Irina of Karim. Allowing her to read from the deacon's own book causes her to tip over into madness as the deacons did.
The dark surrounds me, nibbles at my flesh. Little creatures, they never stop biting.
Tellingly, if spoken to in this state while wearing the armour of Morn, Irina, believing that we are Egon, asks us to kill her.
Oh, you again. Touch me one last time. And kill me, as you promised you would.
This corruption of clerics is apparently so well known that the Way of White's maidens travel with knights who were not just bodyguards, but also expected to perform mercy killings. But what the Way of White weren't prepared for was the entire power structure of the cathedral becoming corrupted. At some point, the kingdom of Lothric was made aware of this. There's a deep battle axe hidden in the high wall, and the knights who patrol the cathedral carry shields depicting an emblem of the old king of Lothric. This may be Oseros, given that the same knights are found in his garden, either protecting him or sealing him away. Regardless, these knights seem to have succumbed to the deep as well, and now worship at the altar with the deacons. We should now return to the evangelists and ask what it is they're actually doing, rather than just spreading the new faith. And the answer is that they're burning and bleeding people. Bloodletting appears to have played a large role in the cathedral's rituals. In what's called the cleansing chapel, we find a notched whip, a weapon that evangelists carry on their belts despite never using. We learn that these whips are used in the cathedral's rituals in order to produce puddles of blood that are then wiped away. This was not flagellation for the sake of inflicting pain. The removal of blood from the body is the point of the exercise. The maces wielded by the evangelists also inflict heavy bleeding, as do the insects they summon from the deep. To see why this might be important, look at what's happened to Irithyll, the home of Aldrich. We learn, firstly, that the weapons of the Pontiff Knights were eaten away by insects. But more interesting are the Irithyll slaves. These aren't like any other hollows we encounter in Dark Souls 3. Their physical bodies have eroded to the point where they barely exist anymore, like something ate them away too. We're told that Irithyll slaves slurp on blood gems, stones which appear to be leaking blood. We don't know why they slurp these stones, but it's an odd detail to highlight, and I'd say it's because the Irithyll slaves were eaten away by the same biting, blood-sucking insects that ate the weapons of the Pontiff Knights. They've been bled out so badly that they barely exist anymore, and they're so desperate for more blood that they're reduced to trying to suck it out of stones. We're never told what the purpose of this bleeding is. We learn in the Painted World that Father Ariandel believed that blood could quench the flame that kept the Painted World alive. This is certainly a possibility, given that Aldrich wants the fire to fade. But there's another component to what the evangelists are doing, and that's burning. The evangelists are the source of the red bug pellets, which they give to their followers to ease their pain as they burn. Likewise, the first evangelist we encounter is kneeling by a burning tree that's apparently being used as a makeshift pyre for the disposal of bodies. And we find two others near another makeshift pyre on the other side of the abandoned church. What they're hoping to achieve by this burning isn't something we're directly told, but there's a clue found in the Painted World. We learn that fire has been used since ancient times to cleanse the human body of something called abyssal pus. The pus of man is something found only in Lothric Castle, and crucially, Lothric Castle is one of the few places we don't find any evangelists. We find no evidence of the pus of man outside of Lothric Castle, despite the vast number of hollowed humans and at least 2 areas that appear to be claimed by the Abyss. This isn't necessarily all the work of the evangelists. The lycanthrope hunters of Farron Woods know to burn bodies after death, and the profaned capital, which itself appears to be sinking into the Abyss, is said to have been consumed by a great firestorm. But without this cleansing fire in Lothric, the pus of man is dominant. In particular, Oceros's garden, in which we find a visually and mechanically similar swamp to the one in the profaned capital, is home to 3 pus of man creatures, the largest number we find in any one place, as well as a lump of human pine resin. Of further interest are the non-hostile transforming hollows around Lothric, who appear to be becoming trees. I say appear to, because in the undead settlement we find corpses and skeletons that literally are becoming trees, with bark and branches. The hollows in Lothric appear to be undergoing a less violent version of the process that creates the pus of man, with their abyssal pus being drawn upwards slowly, rather than violently erupting. Exactly what's going on here isn't explained in Dark Souls 3, but we do learn in the original Dark Souls that humanity can go wild, causing humans to metamorphose into strange, bloated creatures. In particular, Manus, father of the Abyss, who is likely the furtive pygmy. With this in mind, let's go back to the beginning and to the meaning of bastard. If the undead are Otoshiko, abandoned, unwanted children, then whose child are we? The answer, again, appears to be in the original Dark Souls.
The ancient lords found the 3 souls, but your progenitor found a 4th, unique soul, the Dark Soul. Your ancestor claimed the Dark Soul and waited for fire to subside.
It's humans who are the abandoned offspring of Manus, the furtive pygmy, and the curse that the evangelists are cleansing from human bodies through burning and bleeding is the Dark Soul. Where previous Dark Souls games hinged on a binary opposition between fire and dark, Dark Souls 3 suggests something a lot less certain. The climax of the game suggests that the world is in fact entering a new age of ancients, with the last vestiges of human civilization reduced to an expanse of arch trees and ash. And Aldrich, who himself linked the fire, sees beyond fire's fading, and rather than an age of dark, his vision is of an age of deep waters. That we're told about an age of deep waters following the fading of the fire is in and of itself extremely significant, given what we're told by Karth in the original Dark Souls.
And soon the flames did fade, and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark.
The way that Karth explains things makes it sound like the Age of Dark is simply what happens when the fire fades away without being linked, as though dark simply denotes the absence of fire. And yet Aldrich sees beyond the fading of the fire, and rather than an age of dark, his vision is of an age of deep waters. With this in mind, it appears that what's dark about the Age of Dark isn't the lack of light produced by the fire, but the ascendancy of the Dark Soul, a unique soul carried inside of human bodies as humanity. If that's true, then if you were to cleanse human bodies of humanity, and then allow the fire to fade, what followed wouldn't be Karth's Age of Dark, but something else entirely. Through the ritual burning and bleeding of human bodies, the Dark Soul is removed or simply destroyed, leaving behind only human dregs, which sink to a deep sea at the bottom of the earth, preventing Karth's Age of Dark from coming to be. Karth himself, meanwhile, oversees a religious organization, the Sable Church of Londor. Pilgrims have travelled from Londor to Lothric, some of them even reaching the High Wall. The most peculiar feature of the pilgrims is the shells they carry on their backs, underneath which are hints of something growing. While we never get an official description of the pilgrim set, the cleric set features a similar shell, and tells us that clerics wore these shells to avoid becoming something that's described as seedbeds for spreading darkness. The set is found in Undead Settlement, on the pathway leading to the old church where the curse-rotted Greatwood now resides. In the walkway leading to the cloister we find statues of a hunched humanoid figure with something growing on their back. The same statues are also found in the Cathedral of the Deep, as well as another statue depicting what looks to be a more advanced version of the same process. Here we should return again to the cathedral and discuss its association with rebirth through Rosaria. There are a great number of these transforming statues around Rosaria's bedchamber, and we're told that Ringfinger Leonard, who himself served Rosaria as a knight, travelled on a journey of rebirth to the cathedral in order to heal his burned skin. Rebirth was the purpose of Rosaria, and this was known at least as far away as Irithyll. Rosaria's servants, the man-grubs, are those who have been reborn too many times, eventually taking on a form like an earthworm or a maggot. What should be stressed about the man-grubs is that most of them seem to be clerics. They will drop the undead hunter charms of Allfather Lloyd upon death. The projectiles from their bitance produce feathers upon impact. One is found with a miracle, and the other under Gertrude's cage near a blessed gem. We're told, too, that Archdeacon Klimt served Rosaria as a goddess until he put his faith behind him, and around the cathedral we see that the man-grubs have been massacred, and the door to Rosaria's chamber sealed shut. This could be a result of the same coup that overthrew the worship of Velka, or possibly even the cathedral knights sent from Lothric. Despite encountering a large number of hostile and non-hostile clerics throughout Dark Souls 3, we never encounter one with the shell. By weaving together what we know about the cathedral, the cleric set, the man-grubs, and Rosaria, an explanation for this begins to take shape. The cathedral was known as a place of rebirth through Rosaria, and all around the cathedral are statues depicting a hunched humanoid with something growing from their back. The man-grubs are clerics who have been reborn too many times, and the clerics who wore the shells were paranoid about becoming host to something that grew on their back. If rebirth through Rosaria somehow cleansed the body of these growths, then the reason why we never meet any clerics wearing the shell is that in order to purge the darkness from their bodies, they were reborn, eventually becoming man-grubs. Despite apparently being a member of the royal bloodline of Anor Londo, as well as overseeing a group of clerics, Rosaria is the head of a violent invasion-based covenant that's deeply opposed to the gods of Anor Londo. This is something that initially doesn't appear to make very much sense, but, like the Deep, it's something that can be understood by applying Japanese mythology to it. Specifically, the story of Izanagi and Izanami, the first man and woman. When Izanami died in childbirth, Izanagi, her husband, travelled to the underworld to retrieve her. The underworld was such a corrupt place, however, that when Izanagi found Izanami, her body had become rotten and infested with maggots. She begged him to rescue her, but Izanagi refused and sealed the door to the underworld shut with a huge boulder. Betrayed by her husband, Izanami then swore revenge against Izanagi and became the queen of the underworld. While the story of Izanami is not the story of Rosaria, there are enough parallels to suggest that the Inazami story was a major influence on Rosaria. The most obvious of these is the central image of a formerly holy and pure woman who is now trapped in a corrupted place, decaying and covered in maggots. But there are other parallels that are equally notable. Leonard's attempt to liberate Rosaria from the cathedral and return her to Anor Londo parallels to a point the journey that Izanagi took to liberate Izanami from the underworld. Izanami was also punished for speaking before her husband, and had to learn to remain silent. Rosaria, lacking a tongue, is voiceless. As Izanami was sealed in the underworld behind a huge stone, Rosaria is sealed behind barred and locked doors. Izanami is corrupted in part by eating the forbidden food of the underworld, and the cathedral, thanks to Aldrich, is known as a place of forbidden feasting. The Izanami story also helps explain why Rosaria oversees a covenant which is violently opposed to the old gods and the blue spirits who serve them. If Rosaria, like Izanami, were cast out and rejected by the other gods because the cathedral had made her unclean, then Rosaria, like Izanami, may have sworn vengeance on the other gods for abandoning her. Most interestingly, Izanami's firstborn is described as a monstrous creature with no bones, and a soft body like a leech. We're told that Rosaria's firstborn child ripped out her tongue, and that she waits for his return. This raises the possibility, faint though it may be, that Rosaria's firstborn child is Aldrich, having eaten his mother's tongue. If the Mangrubs seek rebirth through Rosaria to avoid becoming host to the spreading darkness, then the Pilgrims appear to be the fate that the Mangrubs avoided, with growths forming under their shells. The Pus of Man, Iudex Gundia, and the Wyverns appear to be even more advanced cases, with what looks like an entirely separate creature breaking free of its host body. Like the spreading darkness feared by the clerics, we're also told that Lothric Castle is beset by the spreading pus of man. We learn this from the archive key, an item we can't attain until after the eclipse begins, an event that heralds the arrival of what the game calls pilgrim butterflies. Like the pus of man, the pilgrim butterflies are something contained entirely within Lothric Castle. It's tempting to suggest that these are what the pilgrims of Londor will transform into. The problem with this is that the pilgrim butterflies don't at all resemble the creatures emerging from the pus of man. The pilgrim butterflies are skeletal, six-limbed, winged humanoids, while the creatures emerging from the pus of man look like huge, oily, bloated snakes with asymmetrical limbs. It's hard to reconcile a connection between the two based on what we see in Dark Souls 3. Or, at least, what we see in the release version of Dark Souls 3. When the first screenshots of Dark Souls 3 were leaked onto the internet in late 2015, they were of a game that was still in development, and consequently not everything in them ended up in the release version. Most of the images we have are of Lothric Castle, which is seen both during the day and blanketed by fog, suggesting the environment was going to change as the game progressed. In one of these images of fog-shrouded Lothric, the bridge connecting the Grand Archives to the Prince's throne room is visible from below. In the sky, where the pilgrim butterflies congregate in the release version, we see what look like winged snakes. These are a far closer match for the pus of man creatures, as well as the transforming statues in the Cathedral of the Deep. If we assume that the pilgrim butterflies occupy the same role in the story as these winged snakes do, and the inconsistency in their design is simply caused by things changing late in production, then these seem to be the final form of the pus of man, the spreading darkness that the clerics are terrified of becoming host to, and what the pilgrims are containing beneath their shells. From the soul stream sorcery found in the Grand Archives, we learn that Prince Lothric allegedly had a private tutor who warned him against linking the fire. It's been suggested that this might be Sullivan, or the Crystal Sages, or even Aldia, but I'd say it's more likely that Lothric's secret tutor is either Karth, or someone acting on Karth's behalf. There are statues of a primordial serpent, possibly Karth, all over Lothric's Grand Archives, including an extremely prominent one near the Wax Pool. And Karth's goal, since the original Dark Souls, has been to spread the dark and the abyss through manipulating the powerful.
Ulusil has brought the abyss upon itself, fooled by that toothy serpent.
They failed me, every last one of them. They were strong, but saw not the truth. I am certain that you will prove different.
And yet Karth's power base lies far outside of Lothric's walls, with the Sable Church of Londor. We learn that it offers Hollows salvation, and that both pilgrims we get a chance to talk to serve Yuria of Londor, who herself serves Karth. Why the pilgrims travel north from Londor to Lothric isn't something we're ever directly told, but if the pilgrimage is overseen by the Sable Church of Londor, then it likely ties into Yuria and Karth's plan to birth a new Dark Lord who can usurp the fire. We also learned that Unkindled play an important part in this plan, not just any undead will do.
Oh, then it's true. A champion of ash as I live and breathe. But if a lost soul should encounter a legend such as you, could that be anything but a movement of fate?
It seems as though the usurpation of fire is only possible with an unkindled host, taking the fire into themselves the same way they take in embers. Notably, it's the pilgrims who Dark Souls 3's introductory cinematic foregrounds, rather than the player character or the Lords of Cinder. They are the ones who made the journey from Londor to Lothric, a journey that's so long and so arduous that they collapse and die along the way. During this pilgrimage, the pilgrims reflect on what the narrator calls the old words.
The fire fades, and the lords go without thrones.
The only other character who speaks these words is the Firekeeper. It appears as though the pilgrimage from Londor to Lothric is being undertaken because the fire is fading and the Lords of Cinder have abandoned their thrones, with the pilgrims shepherded to Lothric in the same way that undead were once shepherded to Lordran. Here I want to briefly consider the state of untended graves. What happens in the Lothric outside of untended graves does affect it, but not in a way that's linear. Killing the Swordmaster of Firelink Shrine will cause him to spawn in untended graves along with the Chaos Blade, suggesting that this is the future. And yet Gundyr is alive and in his prime, and the Shrine Handmaid will recognize us if we speak to her later on, which suggests that this is the past. To further confuse matters, Crimehild, current pupil of the Crystal Sages, will invade the player here, suggesting that this is happening in the present. The exact relationship that Untended Graves has to causality isn't something I want to get into here. What I'm interested in specifically is the Hollow's Ashes. The Hollow's Ashes will spawn in Untended Graves should Yol of Londor fail to completely draw out the player character's hollowing. We're also told that they belong to a Hollow who faithfully served a woman, clearly referencing Yuria and Yol's relationship, so these are likely Yol's ashes. This is very strange. Every other character who drops ashes will drop them in the Lothric that we know of. Furthermore, Yol's ashes won't appear here if he dies through progressing the Lord of Hollows quest. In other words, in order for Yol's ashes to appear in Untended Graves, Yol and Yuria have to fail to find their new Dark Lord. Going back to what I said earlier about Karth's Age of Dark, I'd say that what we're seeing in Untended Graves is what happens when the fire fades away without being usurped. In this world, Lothric let the fire fade away, but Yol and Yuria were unable to find a new Dark Lord to usurp the flame, and so it simply faded away. Yol's inevitable death, regardless of our actions, brings us to another strange detail. The pilgrims travel from Londor to Lothric in order to die there.
I am Yol of Londor, a pilgrim, as you can see, only somehow I failed to die as was ordained.
It's not that they can't die elsewhere. We see one collapse during the introduction, and the two NPC pilgrims we interact with can be killed at any time. The Sable Church, at the behest of Karth, are shepherding pilgrims to Lothric because they need them to die in Lothric. I'm going to suggest that there's another component to the Pus of Man and pilgrim butterflies congregating in Lothric. It's not just that evangelists aren't there to burn the pus away. It's that there's something about Lothric itself that draws out the Dark Soul. A lot of what we see of Dark Souls 3's world suggests that it's going through a kind of big crunch. The physical geography of the world is being drawn toward Lothric Castle, and in the kiln of the First Flame, we see what looks to be the end point of this process. Standing in the doorway of Firelink Shrine and looking outward, we can see that Lothric Castle and the kiln occupy the same space. Whether they truly are one and the same, with Lothric Castle constructed above the original kiln, it's not clear. The point is that both of these things function as a centre toward which everything is being drawn. I'd suggest that this goes further than just the physical lands, and that the Dark Soul itself is being drawn toward Lothric. It's drawn out of the hollows there, either violently as the pus of man, or slowly and gradually as the trees. And thus the pilgrims, hollows themselves, must travel to Lothric to ensure that their deaths release the Dark Soul in a way that benefits Karth's Age of Dark. Dark Souls 3 takes for granted that the fire is going to fade, and even if we choose to link it, it's made very clear more than in any previous game that all we're doing is postponing the inevitable. This shifts the question from will the Age of Fire continue to what happens next? What's particularly notable about the Usurpation of Fire ending is that the eclipse changes colour, the orangey-brown hue of the sun becoming grey, as we take the fire into ourselves, as though fire and the light of the sun were one and the same thing. We learn in the introductory cinematic to the original Dark Souls that the 4 Lord Souls were found within the first flame, and if we take the introductory cinematic completely literally, then the flame was found deep underground during the Age of Ancients. Since we seem to be entering a new Age of Ancients at the end of Dark Souls 3, it looks like this process is recurring. Souls are being drawn up into the sun, which will then sink underground, becoming the first flame to be discovered again by another group of hollows. But by usurping the flame, taking it into ourselves, we completely break this cycle. Not the cycle of fire and dark that obsessed Aldia, but the cycle of the entire Dark Souls universe. Before closing, I want to take one final look at the pilgrims. It's not just their backs that have growths on them. There's also a kind of skirt made of what look like tree roots growing downward from their bodies. These look to be the same growths emerging from the Aldrich faithful's bodies and eyes, as well as Aldrich himself. Compare them to the branches of humanity growing from the hollows in Lothric Castle, and the way that the pus of man is drawn upward and out of the body. The Aldrich faithful, having been cleansed of the bastard's curse, have bodies that produce human dregs that sink downward. The pilgrims have both, needing a shell on their backs to keep their humanity in check, while also having parts of their body drawn downward. When Yoel begs for death, he refers to it as the undoing of his shackles. Seen this way, Yoel's shackles could be the dregs, the heavy, soulless matter of his body that keeps him tied down to the earth. But when we find him, he is, like Lothric itself, trapped in a limbo state between sinking and rising. If this is the final game in the series, then it's fitting it should end this way, with the binary oppositions that drove the first 2 games finally being resolved, but this resolution then revealing another set of oppositions.